No true Nigerian can in any way be proud of what happened that autumn of 1966, and it is not the intention of this work to dwell on those terrible events. But it would be equally impossible to describe the life of Emeka Odumegu Ojukwu without regard to what he did, why he did, and what influence formed his view and his options. For this reason, some mention of the events of the last 4 months of 1966 must be made, however briefly. After the few random killings of Easterners in the north that panicked the Eastern delegates on 11 September, there was a lull of a week. Then the killings began again with renewed vigor between 18th and 24th September while the ad hoc constitutional conference was sitting in Lagos. The outbreaks began within days, sometimes hours of each other at Makurdi, Minna, Boko, Gombe, Jos, Sokoto, and Kaduna. They quickly spread to Kano, Zaria, Ojukwu, Bauchi, Zungeru, and elsewhere. From the flame, they became bushfire before the end of the month. Again, rented buses were seen speeding across the north, bringing armed agitators to fresh towns and villages. In each case, the message was the same: kill the Easterners. While Igbos were the main targets, others of Eastern origin were not spared. In the main centers, hideous massacres took place as mobs, sometimes led by soldiers and native police officers, raged through the Sabon Geris, hacking, sparing, cutting, chopping, and shooting any Easterner they came across. On 29 September, Yakubu Gowon made a radio broadcast apparently intended to bring the violence to an end. It had exactly the opposite effect. On that very day, the program of killings exploded from a bushfire into an all-consuming conflagration. As September merged into October, bodies piled so high in some northern towns and cities that corporation dust carts were used to shovel them up and bury them in mass graves outside the city walls. Not unnaturally, there were a number of consequences to these events. On 3rd October, the Constitutional Conference was adjourned, in no small part because the Eastern delegation felt it could no longer go on. The northern troops stationed in the west, in breach of the 9th August Agreement, had taken to copying their brothers further north, and random killing of Easterners had begun in the west also. The Yoruba took no part in this, but stood by helplessly. Another effect was the streams of Easterners began to flee the north in terror, leaving behind all they possessed. As October moved into November, this stream became a flood. The third effect was the spirit of rage and terror, but above all, terror began to grip the East. A number of reasons were later adduced for this spate of massacres in the north and west, but none really makes any sense. It could hardly have been revenge for the action of 4 Igbo officers the previous January, for such revenge had been taken with enormous overkill in late July. Another reason later given with the full support of the Gowon government was that the massacres were in response to violence against northerners living in the east. The facts show this does not simply make sense either. Although there was some violence against individual northerners, it was manifested a full 7 days after the northern killings began. There were never more than a few thousand northerners living in the east as against the hundreds of thousands of easterners in the north. But when violence was shown to these people, Emeka's reaction was fast and decisive. Aware that while the northern killings went on, their safety was at risk, he ordered them all to be escorted safely out of the east. Under police escort, the northerners were embarked on a series of trains which took them to safety to the north. On one occasion, when the train was stopped by an enraged Igbo mob at Imo River Bridge, a number were hurt but none killed. The Eastern police did their duty and got the train moving again to the north.
You are now at Enugu. We have arrived
at Enugu Airport, where we were all brought together. I was able to meet others refugees from other towns like Aba, Umuahia, Okigwe, Abakaliki, Ahoda, Onitsha, and Enugu, and everybody narrated their own eyewitness story. But one thing I have to confess here is some of them who were there also narrated how they were saved by the Igbos. But most of us in Elele, apart from me, were hidden by the people of Elele because they said they have lived there for over 100 years, that they cannot see any reason why some group will come outside to start the killing. So the people of Elele also helped in hiding so many northerners.
We're at Enugu. Go on. So what experiences did you hear from those other people?
The same story of killing and, the same story of killing. And each time I listen to Chief Odumegwu Ojukwu, whether interview or broadcast, I have always been expecting that no matter what, let him one day accept that northerners were also killed in the East. Even the last article, the last interview he granted in September last year, September 3rd, to Tell magazine, I reacted that I'm still waiting for someone to say, look, actually, northerners, easterners were killed in the north, but northerners were also killed in the east. At least I'm a living witness.
Emeka's ability to control his own police force and few soldiers contrasted dramatically with Gowon's complete inability to do anything to protect his fellow Nigerians in his own home region. This contrast between the two men, between the ability of one to act with vigor and decisiveness and to be obeyed, and the other only to dither and wring his hands in pious regret, was to be underlined frequently in the months still to come as Nigeria headed for the abyss. While this was going on, invitations were issued for the resumption of the Constitutional Conference. As the bodies of Easterners were lying a little thick in the streets of Western cities by this time, the suggestion that Eastern delegates should return to the heart of it was somewhat unrealistic. On 30th November, Gowon dismissed the conference on the grounds that it could serve no further purpose and announced that a committee would draft a new constitution based on between 8 and 14 states. Emeka was aghast, for he was practical enough to realize that the time to talk about radical restructuring of the country is when calm prevails and all parties to the restructuring can meet in peace and discuss the process. To propose such a thing while massacring and ripping a country apart is hardly the best moment, but he also realized his former army colleague, like Ironsi before him, had fallen under the influence of a clutch of personal advisors whose advice he would accept and follow without further question. Such is always the way of weak men.
Fighting a war, knowing the difficulties, the odds against us, there is an element of fatalism, people feeling, well, if the world chooses to abandon us, then perhaps it is better we all perish. They don't ever consider a Biafra not free. They believe in either Biafra free or no Biafra at all. That means none of us living to see it.
The group in this case were the new power brokers, the middle belt civil servants, with northern civil servants tending to stay in the north and westerners tending to stick to western affairs, and with eastern civil servants now in headlong flight for safety across the Niger. The new group had taken over the reins of administrative authority. They realized that strong regions were their worst enemy, but numerous and weak regions with a strong center and they in control of the center would give them the power that had never been theirs yet. Walter Schwartz, a noted writer in Nigeria, later referred to this takeover as effective civil service power as the third coup. But Emeka had more pressing problems nearer home. The tide of inflowing refugees had become a flood, and each bore some horrific tale. Some came across the Benue or the Niger bearing frightful wounds, and the hospitals were soon overflowing. Even those who escaped intact recounted stories of the horrors they had seen, and popular despair, fear, and anger rose throughout the region. Exactly how many refugees poured into the eastern region between mid-September and 31st December will never be precisely known. But subsequent effort by the Gowon government, vigorously assisted by spokesmen for the British High Commission and diplomatic memoir writers to suggest the whole business was a minor irritation, if not actually an optical illusion, are both cynical and unhelpful. The fact is that the Goan regime never instituted an inquiry, judicial or otherwise, into what happened that autumn and winter, or into the results it produced in terms of refugees. The only inquiry was conducted by Mr. Gabriel Onyuike, a former Nigerian Attorney General in the East. After weeks of seeking to track down sources of the information, checking school records for new entrants in January 1967, and checking out hospital lists and salary claims, he estimated the influx of refugees to have been between 1 million and 1,200,000 from the north and half that number from the other two regions. The death toll was put at something like 30,000 human beings. By any standards, even in a country as thickly populated as Nigeria, such figures constitute a national catastrophe. For a region with a resident population of about 17 million to try to absorb even 1.5 million is almost unprecedented in world history. All the social services in the East, medical, welfare, housing, education were bursting under the strain. The region was in uproar and tumult. The reaction from Goan in Lagos was interesting, in as much as there was none. Not one public statement of regret, sorrow, pity, sympathy, not one proposal of an inquiry into what had happened, why it had happened, and who had been responsible. Not one offer of federal aid, relief, or assistance. Not even a private message as between the self-styled Supreme Military Commander and one of the regional military governors expressing a purely personal concern or condolence. The only thing that came true was in the 30th November broadcast. After announcing the intention to make unilateral constitutional changes, Goan added the threat to use force if circumstances compel.
Do you think that it will be necessary to use military force to bring down Colonel Ojukwu's regime?
Yes, it is necessary. I think I have made this point before that if the integrity, corporate existence of this country is threatened, I will use force to maintain it. And I'm afraid the time has come.
As a catalogue of misgovernment, Yakubu Gowon's performance that autumn and winter must surely go into the record books. Before Christmas, the cries had already started across the eastern region that the region should pull out of Nigeria completely. It was argued that the 100 days of killings could only have had their objectives to drive the Easterners out of the north and perhaps out of Nigeria. If that was the intention of the inspiration of the organizers of what happened, it succeeded admirably. Considering that the finger was later pointed at Emeka as the moving force behind the Eastern secession into Biafra, his reaction that time is interesting. The record shows beyond a doubt that far from whipping up the secessionist cries, he tried hard to calm the tension and mute the more extremist elements. He made not one speech in incitement, never once urged local passions to be inflamed even further. Just the opposite, the record shows that while millions of Easterners were quite convinced that the old Nigeria was dead and that only a battered shell of it remained, Emeka in public, in council and in private urged that there was a chance that one Nigeria could still be saved. He was almost completely alone in this. The loudest in their cries for an instant departure of the region from Nigeria, the most shrill in their denunciation of all Nigeria and Nigerians, tended to be the ousted civil servants and some academics or self-styled intellectuals. But then people who have just lost their jobs and their homes usually tend to be more extreme than those who have not. But it is ironic that among the loudest clamor for extremist policies at that time were some who later became the first to seek favor with Gowon and Lagos in early 1970 and to denounce Emeka as the sole guilty party. The Igbo people have noted them. The weeks of December rolled by without a hint of any offer of help from Lagos for the eastern problems, and Emeka had to cope with them all alone. They were cooped up, but it took a huge administrative effort. Fortunately, as a former administrator, Emeka was able to use his experience and understanding of public administration to the full. The hospitals slowly emptied, work was found for the unemployed, the hundreds of thousands of extra children were taken into schools, and the extended family system provided a roof and food for the refugees. But the strain on the regional budget was intolerable without aid from Lagos. The only last chance it became clear was for all the military governors within the framework of the Supreme Military Council to meet somewhere and try to sort out the country's urgent problems. Far from being opposed to this, Emeka gave the idea his immediate approval. As usual, he strongly supported the idea of negotiation and reconciliation rather than that of confrontation. It is probable, with hindsight, that had he chosen to urge his people to succeed then, with the events of September to December still so fresh in the minds not only of Nigerians but of all Africa and the rest of the concerned world, the world reaction might have well been different and much more in his favor. But he supported more negotiation. The problem was where? There was nowhere in Nigeria in those days where he could have gone in guaranteed safety. The rest of the Supreme Military Council would not come to the east. Finally, General Ankara of Ghana agreed to host a conference in his territory, and the venue chosen was ex-President Nkrumah's country house on the hills above Accra at a place called Aburi.